This week I'm joined once again by Kingsley Dennis to discuss his latest book, Hijacking Reality, the Reprogramming and Reorganization of Human Life. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paid patrons and subscribers making all of this work possible, and if you would like to support Hermitix or become part of the community, please find links in the description below. Enjoy. Kingsley Dennis, thanks once again for coming on to Hermitix podcast to roughly discuss. We sort of mentioned this just now that we both prefer the conversational style, so this will probably be more of a conversation, but it loosely based around your most recent book published just in February, actually, Hijacking Reality, the Reprogramming and Reorganization of Human Life, which is sort of a book about freedom in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and our notions of consensus reality. So yeah, Kingsley, thanks for coming on. And I was just saying, this book seems to have sort of appeared from nowhere.
Yeah, thanks, James. And it was a very quickly birthed book. A lot of the content came out because during 2020, 2020 was a kind of very intense writing spree for me. I wrote a lot of material, and I wrote a series of essays, which I kind of loosely published at the end of 2020, called Notes from the Quarantine. But they were kind of, they were different topics about how we deal with it psychologically, with what we're going through, etc. And then I wished to put them into a more kind of coherent kind of narrative, and to try to make them kind of tell a story. And the story is, what is this story that we're breaking down around us? The main theme was like on two areas. One is the breakdown of consensus reality. So we're now kind of without a dominant story, but also on the other hand, it seems that there's various players coming into this kind of vacuum and trying to push certain stories onto us, which is what you mentioned about the notion of freedom. We're in this area where we're kind of confused. Many people have bouts of cognitive dissonance. It's much easier to implant a new dominant narrative, and I want to look at that. So that's the kind of themes that I decided to tie into a more coherent book, and that came out as Hijacking Reality.
Yeah, I mean, it's a book that sort of, I guess, for people such as yourself writing about these topics, thinking about these topics, something along these lines has to come, whatever you make of the COVID-19 pandemic, whatever you want to call it, whether or not you believe it is some sort of reprogramming, whether or not you believe the conspiracies, whether or not, and I mean, I'm sort of in I put my skin in the game here. I'm in the it seems to be a fairly unique camp of people who believe the virus is very, very serious, believe that we shouldn't, willingly, if we know that masks help or whatever restrictions help, that we shouldn't willingly, ignore them because then we're harming others. But at the same time, I'm highly, highly skeptical of the government intervention because I'm skeptical of, that being lent on and being utilized later on, in terms of, I think it's even mentioned in your book that Foucauldian emphasis of a medical narrative where that is used to legitimize the restrictions of certain freedoms, and certain sort of words and, should we say, medical linguistic apparatus in a way used to justify basically taking away certain freedoms. Whether or not that will happen to the extent some people think it will, who knows? But that's sort of the camp I'm in which is a strange one because it seems hypocritical, but I don't really think it is. It can be serious. The virus is serious, but at the same time, the loss of liberty is equally potentially as serious. So there we go. But I mean, I re-listened to both our previous chats because I'd say, in keeping with your book, The Seeker, we're both seekers of truth, and that was the direction I sort of wanted to take this conversation, is because we've, much like your Healing the Wounded Mind book, you begin from that proposition, look, we know this isn't the way things should be, and I found this book, it has its context, it has its reasons, but I found it to be not in a super critical way and not in a negative way, to be treading that same ground in a way which brings light to the COVID situation. So I remember thinking to myself, me and Kingsley Dennis is just sort of both trying to figure out that that crucial next step, which is, okay, we know things are like not as they should be. And then the next step is to ask, obviously, how should they be and how do we get there, which is, the most difficult bit. But you use a term a lot, consensus reality. You used it just then. So in what way do you use that term? Because I think this is like the backbone of your understanding of how things can be used and freedoms can be lost.
Yeah. Before I answer that, James, if I just can kind of come back on the tail end of what you were saying. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's right. When we're talking, even when we're talking between ourselves or I'm writing a book, it's like we're jamming, we're jamming to kind of trying to find a rhythm. And, you're right in saying that, and you mentioned this in in personal correspondence, is that my main thread is I'm trying to figure out what is reality. And, and that's a jam, because there's no kind of, you don't get to the solution or the rhythm straight away. And you're trying to pull away the layers. And the book Hijacking Reality is another attempt to try to look at what's going on in this kind of reality game or construct. Now, you talked about your position vis-a-vis the kind of the COVID, and we're not totally apart, because I've always said that there's different elements here. One is the biological element and one is the social element. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And on one side, you've got, okay, there's a biological disease, pandemic virus. Now, a lot of people are trying to debate what's the origin of that. Is it manufactured? Is it natural? The thing is, we're never going to get to the bottom of that. And that's just another kind of labyrinth. Now, I've always said, well, let's not get tangled up in that. I prefer to look at the response, mm-hmm. what we may call pandemic response, the social, political, cultural framework that responds to that. And you can find out a lot more by looking at the response than you can at this, biological side. And it's the same kind of perspective I took with the book. As you may note, I never argue about, what is the biological framework of this. I'm saying, look, this has happened. Let's look at the social, political, cultural framework around it. And then we can see a kind of play of how reality and narratives are coming around it. And to get to the question of consensus reality is that we're always working with stories. Humanity has always been a story. We tell ourselves stories. And there's certain major powers or institutions or authorities that try to lay on the dominant narrative. Now, ever since humanity came out of its localized communities and tribal gatherings, it went into more larger kind of civilizational conglomerates, those stories have been bigger and bigger. And, largely they became based around religious, so-called spiritual stories. What are our position in terms of the creator or the God or the cosmos? And then, over kind of many centuries, that kind of got morphed into a scientific story. Like we can work out via our instruments, what is the human story, Is the Earth the center of the cosmos, or do the planets go around the Earth? They were the older stories. And now, we had stories of nationalism, that you're born in a country and you are having allegiance and loyalty, etc. Thing is, these stories have been kind of also been reimagined and retold. And every kind of era that we come to, the dominant authorities try to place a more or less consensus narrative, because it forms a social management. It forms how we can manage these, now, of course, billions of people, before millions of people. So how do we kind of manage that? And we do it by stories. If we can agree on a story, we can have a conversation. We're on the same page, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Now, for quite a while, in terms of modernity, these stories have been breaking down. The so-called definition of postmodernity is there's no meta-narrative. There's just all these different stories coming around. And especially with the internet and global communications, people have been investing in different stories. And we've seen that the kind of social political authorities are having problems with, now there's so many different narratives. Is this narrative censored? Is the other narrative misinformation or conspiracy theory? And they're trying to label these different narratives so they can still get a hold of a dominant narrative. And that's where I think we've come to, is that, there's a kind of vacuum, there's a breakdown, there's a melting of a trust, a faith, a belief in an overall story that gives us meaning. And so there's certain, I call them globalist stories, coming in to say, well, let's have this global story and you can believe in that and just, sit back and be at peace. We'll tell you the story. And that's the danger. And that's what I see coming in. And for me, at the moment, James, that's the kind of my perspective on reality. Who's coming in and trying to tell us our stories?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, it's interesting what you say that, because I sort of notice a paradox in the way that these stories are being told, because, as you outline throughout history, we go from these bigger stories, the stories of religion or a god which literally controls the whole universe. That's almost the biggest story you could tell. What is life itself is the biggest stories you could tell. And then it comes down to maybe the planets, which is a bit smaller, and then it comes down to nations, and then maybe it now comes down to, in a way, brands or what you identify with. And slowly we've been told the story of complete atomized individuality. It seems to me the underlying tenet of liberalism, or if you want to call it neoliberalism, is that the individual is their own personal sort of consumerist god. What you consume, what you buy, what you identify with is your personality, your identity, yourself, and that is the story we're told. But at the same time, we're told that global narrative, and there's a paradox there where they can't really communicate with one another, because you're told one thing and it doesn't. I think that what can break reality, or what can break at least the consensus that there is some consensus reality, is these hypocrisies coming to the surface. And I mean, this is something that John Michael Greer said, is that one thing this pandemic has really sort of accelerated is the complete destruction of many of these stories that we tell ourselves, the stories of progress, the stories of, democracy as being the best thing that could ever happen, the stories of, globalism being, the best thing that can happen. And the problem I think we're left with is those stories have removed a lot of our self-motivation and our own understanding of tools and ideas and the know-how to do things, and we haven't got any replacements. So we're stuck. This is why it was interesting to me that you mentioned nihilism in your book. It's because it seems to me that this nihilism is because we've been left in a place where we're almost like in Waiting for Godot, right? Where we're waiting for the story. We're like craving, or many people seem to be craving that next story to come in and fill the void. Or people are, it makes me laugh that people who are in lockdown are saying things like, "Oh, I just can't wait to go on a cruise," right? They're just absolutely yearning for what they consider reality to come back, even though it's broken. It's strange.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I completely agree with that. And there could be a kind of narrative behind that as well, because if you want to bring in a replacement story or a replacement system, then often you have to take apart to rebuild. Now, for a certain period of time, you can keep kind of plastering on top. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, every few years you want to repaint the house. Okay, you can repaint it X number of times because one color goes on the next, and it more or less fits. Mm-hmm. So, but after a while, you realize that you can't repaint anymore because there's just too many kind of plastering coming off the walls. It's getting haggard. You can't repaint. You've got to take it all off. And I think we're in one of those moments. And at the beginning of in my introduction, I kind of made an analogy saying, I know it's quite dramatic, but you can see this as being a kind of global mind programming operation. Is that if you want to implant something new, you have to fragment the mind. And by fragmenting, you create this breakdown. And as you said, there's a need, there's a longing for wholeness, for coherency. And then you offer this coherency and you kind of allow them to, re-wholeness the mind, but you've implanted something. And that's why I call it a nihilism, because the stories or the narratives or the reality constructs that we've bought into, we're invested in, or we construct in collaboration with the, let's say, external world, that gives us security. That gives it a certain comfort zone. And for so long, we've had this security. The past generation, maybe our fathers, had the security that the story was you worked with a company all your life, and then they gave you a gold watch on retirement, and you had a good pension. That story of security was operative in the previous generation. Now we don't have that, and we got to a point where people were kind of restless and were thinking, well, there's no future story. I mean, even the financial future is broken. We don't have pensions, we don't have careers. And then right at that moment in 2020, we got the ultimate pinnacle in let's break down the past story. And now there is this accelerated nihilism whereby we thought we had no idea before. Now we've got really no idea. I mean, what's coming? And in that that's a vulnerability. And in that mental, psychological, and emotional vulnerability, I'm saying that, well, let's look around us. Are we witnessing certain globalist forces coming in and saying, it's okay, we'll give you a story, we'll give you security, we'll give you biological security, technological security, perhaps even a financial universal basic income security. We'll give you a digital infrastructure where you can entertain yourself if you can't leave your house. And so things are coming in rapidly. And when people are vulnerable, that's the time when they are more eager to latch onto this coherent external story. And I'm investigating that. I'm not saying it's A or B, but I'm saying we have to look at that and see, what are we seeing?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of like, I mean, this is something I wanted to bring in because I think, I don't know, I've realized it recently in a lot of my reading is that Western culture in particular is basically just a culture of somnambulance. We revere it. We revere being hypnotized in some form, which is just another way, I guess, of saying you're being told a story. But sometimes the hypnotism, it lasts a lifetime, like you said, with the that whole generation who had that comfy retirement still believe that story and just see everyone else who isn't able to attain that as those who, they should just believe the story. Something's gone wrong, not with the story itself, that's still true, but something's gone wrong somewhere else, so it's like an incompatibility with the story. So, when these people, I'll try not to sound too bitter about that generation because I know, you get the lot you do in life and they got the golden era. But back when you could, off one single household job, have a family of 4, 2 cars, a house paid off by the time you're sort of 50 off one basic job, that isn't quite factually isn't a possibility anymore. And yet that is the backbone of their story. So there's almost that incompatibility there. And I think it's interesting to me, when you mention this accelerated nihilism, as you said, the younger generations, as from what I'm seeing on it sounds ridiculous, but on social media sites or various clips I see, not that I spend too much time on it, but things like TikTok or wherever these generations are, they don't seem to have an overarching story and are heavily reliant on irony and sarcasm and sort of deconstruction and postmodernism. And it seems to me that what's happening with that is extremely strange, and I can't really put it into words. But I think that's the question you have to ask is as you say, you're left with this vulnerability. So it's the difference between basically accepting whatever story comes your way, such as the Great Reset, or such as, I think there's another name for it, something along those lines, or forming one yourself. But of course, we're not really given the means to do that. So where do you go from there?
Well, yes, and maybe we don't have we may have the means, but we don't recognize that we have the means. And I think perhaps here there's also a significant point in that there's a sense that we've lost the sovereign self. Mm-hmm. Because, in modernity and postmodernity, as you said, they talk about the individual being the priority. But it's the individual, the notion of the individual as looking after yourself and being apart from the whole collective or the community, kind of like fighting for your own kind of path. But that's very different from being individualized. And I'm kind of also making a point now of these two paths. The individual is vulnerable because they're not having they're kind of not connecting and communicating or collaborating with a kind of community sense or community story. And so that makes them vulnerable to these external authoritative powers. So, and they get distracted. As you say, they go into deconstruction or irony. They go into forms of, complete dissonance through entertainment, if we can call it entertainment, and they're just being kept away from their self. So ironically, they feel like they're the individual, but the individual is getting further away from a sense of what is their self, their sovereign self. Whereas perhaps what we need is people to look at the individualized, where you need a sense of inner realization so that you can be both a sovereign self and be a part of your larger community. And that's no loss of yourself. Because if you feel that you have your own story, that gives you meaning. And if you feel that you can be part of let's say, a larger cosmic meaning, and that gives you an inner strength, and that gives you independence, and that you can break away on your own, then, of course, that is contrary to what, let's say, the overarching governing narrative wants, because it wants you to feel like you need to be a part of their story. And I think that's what's going on now. I think there's a kind of contestation between people who are being persuaded or compelled to just accept what is now being told to them as the new story, and those people which are saying, well, something still doesn't feel quite right, doesn't sit with me, and I need to find a story for myself. And I think this, in the long term, can be a positive thing, because it does kind of trigger people to kind of push themselves and work on themselves. But in the short term, I think what it may result in is more kind of breakdown of social alliances, whereby we've been pit against our friends or our community, our network, even our family, if they're not on the same page. And this is creating vulnerability at the moment. But maybe we need that triggering, because unless you kind of take away the layers, you're never going to be able to kind of build up your own path. So maybe it was necessary, but it's going to be uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, this idea of building up your own path. I mean, you bring up the problem of sort of time and how we understand time in the book, and I think the problem is as you say, with this metaphor of peeling back the paint, and eventually you've got to go, okay, we need to get back down to the foundations here, is that I think a lot of people, even if they're trying to form their own story, don't realise that maybe there was a couple of layers of paint left on there which they mistook for the actual foundation itself. And there's certain notions, I think, which seem so universal, especially, even the way that we believe reality to work, or we believe time to work, and and I mean, I know I harp on about it, but progress seems to be one. And actually this ties in with something which you note in the book, which is the recent explosion of post-apocalyptic media. And I'll hopefully be able to tie these all together. But the notion of progress, the notion that things either slowly get better, in which itself implies that things can also get worse in this linear fashion. Now, I think if you pay attention to the world, just give it basic attention, you realise most of the time that's not really how things work, because the whole notion of progress is obviously completely subjective. What I consider, something to have progressed is my own idea of it. If there was less industry, I'd probably consider that progress. Others wouldn't, etc. And I think mistaking the way that time works for that progressive way is the way that a lot of people are trying to build their own stories. And I think this is why there's this appeal for post-apocalyptic media, is because it's just this fantasy where everyone feels a bit stuck, and they're waiting for something to happen in that progressive state, which is suddenly just going to just reset it. The beauty of post-apocalypse is you don't have to go to your 9-to-5 job, right? You don't have to do all those things that deep down you really don't want to do. And I think the realization needs to be that there isn't going to be that sudden event. That's never going to happen. And you're still reliant on that notion of sort of linear time, whereas what you need to do is sort of separate yourself from that notion of time and just begin when you can. I don't know what you'd make of that, but that's sort of my 2 cents on the problem, the problem of building your own story, as it were.
Yeah. I mean, I think I mentioned in the book I gave a suggestion. I said, think back to prior to 2020 when the concept of wearing masks in the streets just to go leave your home, or this social distancing, and then could you imagine it coming into to be your way of life? And then now, even speaking to my friends and people I know, they say, it's even hard to imagine what life was like before 2020, the pandemic, because we got so used to wearing masks, or got so used to going to a supermarket and having these stickers on the floor where you're having to be distanced. And it makes you realize that if you can bring in an idea that's so powerful that then almost erases, obliterates the previous idea, then your memory just kind of wipes it. And that's kind of apocalyptic as well, because the sense of apocalypse is that it's a moment which is, apocalyptic can be breakdown or renewal, depending on what comes out of that. But it's an event so powerful that it completely cuts off the previous timeline. And whatever happens after that, it's like restarting the clock. And so it does interfere with the mind's linear memory database. So even though, like, say, it's been 12 months, March of 2020, since we've had these new regulations, it seemed like a whole world apart, because conceptually it was a world apart. It was a completely different story. And so when you're then in a kind of, post-apocalyptic moment, or you can restart the new timelines, there's a disjuncture. I think our generation living this now are going to have a real disjuncture between pre-2020 and post-2020. Even greater than perhaps pre and post the world wars, because it is literally reprogramming us. It doesn't have to be a conspiracy, but it means it's reprogramming us in our sense of how to live our life, and really a whole sense of what is the social, what is the human in the social. And we weren't really prepared for that at all. And we never thought it was going to happen to us. So yes, the old 9 to 5 stories are in a sense, we have freedom from that, but the whole sense of work is going to be redesigned, and the whole sense of human interaction. So, time is not going to be the same, but I don't know. No one knows what's going to come out from this. Some people will readjust in different ways. Some people will be gagging to go back to their so-called normal. But, there never was a normal. There was just a dominant story. And so, yeah, it's kind of like you have a carpet full of dust, and you bang the carpet, all the dust rises in the air and it falls down differently. And we don't know how it's going to fall down yet. And so there is no future yet. We are literally writing the future, but the question is, who's writing the future?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think this is probably where the first almost disagreement is going to come in, because I think even though you're saying who's going to write the future, people could take over, you seem to be more optimistic than me in terms of potential freedoms, at least. I mean, when you mentioned life before the pandemic, people mentioning, I can't remember life before the pandemic, and I've witnessed this. Loads of people say, I can't really remember what it was like. This just seems so normal now. And you say, this is because it's almost been this event which is so powerful that it's sort of uprooted the previous reality, and this one is so powerful and overbearing that we can't remember the last one. I would sort of jump in there and say that actually that's because the previous reality was really completely dull for most people, and they had so little attention of what was actually going on that nothing really stuck in their mind. And I mean, obviously that I'm sympathetic to the notions of being asleep or waking sleep, and I think that's what I would find there, is that people another event could come along and completely uproot this one, and people would say, people would probably forget that this ever happened. And I personally think that that notion of accelerating time is so unfathomably quick in quotation marks, though, not quick in the sense of sort of speed, but quick in the sense of reappropriation. The next thing you know, everything has just been overhauled. That I can just about recall the days when certain news events, not to be too morbid, but let's take for instance 9/11 or the first of that sort of era of school shootings. They would be on the news for weeks, if not months, maybe even close to a year. They'd still be going on about those first shootings or those big events. Nowadays, they take up maybe a day in people's memory, unless of course you're local to them, etc. But most of the time, they are just fleeting sort of bits of data which come and go. And I think even though this has been an 18-month sort of struggle, I think you'll be surprised at how quickly people completely forget it. And that's sort of my pessimistic point is, what is that state of being which we just quickly sink back into, when we don't have to be at least somewhat attentive? And perhaps that's my biggest worry, is that would be the real clincher in terms of how I understand people's freedom is if this ends and just nothing changes and people just slump back into it. And it's a funny footnote in history, what does that say about humanity?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's much difference in what we're saying. We're just looking at from different angles. Now, there is a very dark element to this, and I tend to mention the dark, but not try to always focus on it, completely, because yes, I do have a kind of optimistic side of me that there's an element of human resilience that will come through. But again, when we're talking about the general overall kind of collective, there is definitely there's a sleep going on here, and any event has the potential to do both things, and it operates on both sides. Any event, whether it's the pandemic or 9/11 or something, it can trigger people to be more aware, but it can also trigger a greater depth of sleep. So, an event like 9/11, many people after that were like triggered to say, whoa, I mean, let's look at these stories we've been told. It doesn't seem right. And the rest of them many others were pulled deeper into the dominant story. So there's both elements. Now, but on the whole, we are asleep, because it's like shifting from one reality construct to another reality construct. All we're doing is shifting the storyline of the dream. For example, if we can remember that film by Christopher Nolan, Inception, which actually I rewatched recently. And if you remember that storyline, James, it's like these people are hacking the dreams of people, and they go in and they can go down to like 4 or 5 layers within the person's dream. And the first layer of the dream, the person's subconscious can pick you up, or their defenses come and attack you, like the immune system. And then you have to get past them and get to the second layer of the dreamer's mind, then the third layer. And they get so down into the depth of the dreamer's mind that their subconscious can no longer defend them, because they've gone beyond those barriers. And in a sense, I think that metaphor is very appropriate to what's happening in our reality construct, is that when one construct, it's not as if we're waking up, is that there's a danger that we're being pulled into yet a deeper part of the reality construct. And if we don't start to be critically aware, or to try to see through this and to individualize our sovereign self, then we may just be pulled further and further into dream, whereby in the end, there's no possibility to see beyond the veil. And that's the pessimistic part, is that, as you said, there's just nothing there to kind of wake you up anymore. You could see shootings on TV and you think, yeah, what's that's the norm. We could have the point where we are segregated into our communities, which are surveyed by drones, and like we can't leave because there's terrorists out there the other side of the wall. And you go, yeah, that's the state of affairs. We're in a security state. So there's this danger that the dream just gets deeper and deeper. And if we don't start to have these conversations and to start to do our own individual work, then we'll be pulled into the dream, James.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, yeah, I do agree with that. I mean, this is one of the things that you brought up, and was something that I thought, a few sort of months once the pandemic sort of got rolling. You state that it's akin to a stop exercise, and for those that don't know, I mean, this has probably been. I'm not sure the origins of the stop exercise. I'm not sure if it originated with Gurdjieff, but I'm sure it didn't. I'm sure it's elsewhere. But the point of a stop exercise is you shout stop, and the person has to absolutely freeze their thoughts and their body in that exact posture. And you from that you can realize where you're storing energy, what you're thinking about, how you perhaps are lazily using your body, and more, a lot of other things. What you're emotionally like in that state, and what it allows you to do is to realize and be attentive of which posture you go into next, and it allows you to be attentive of your postures generally, and metaphorically speaking, of course. It allows you to be attentive of things that you may have just slunk into without you realizing. And you state that this pandemic is almost like a global stop exercise, where all of a sudden it's like, right, bam, and everything's changed. And we had that moment, we had this moment of like sort of a couple of weeks where governments were saying like, right, shut down, lockdown, and it was completely surreal. And I think everyone sort of questioned it. But I think what didn't happen was, okay, we noticed our habits, we noticed things, and it just seems that the first thing people were thinking about was just getting back on that treadmill and just going straight back into the posture they had just left, right? They didn't stop to think, like, maybe we could use this for something. And I'm sort of repeating the same thing here, that I just... Perhaps I'm, ye of little faith. I don't have too much faith in the collective, because this is ultimately down to the individual. And perhaps that's the problem, is how, like you said about Inception. It's like you could think of it as layers of hypnotism. I mean, you might think you're free because you've got the better job or something like that, but you still don't realize you're abiding by the next layer down of hypnotism, and it's that you need to address, and that's the problem, I think.
Yeah, and the cat's out the bag, to use that phrase. Like I said, I think the first most opportune moment was the first lockdown, because it was so novel and it was so unexpected, and we thought, most of us, as I suppose in the Western world, that we have freedom as a given, that a national and then a global lockdown would just be not possible. And perhaps the, let's say, the larger governing structures, governing institutions, and the people in power also wondered, like, could we get away with it? What if we put the people in lockdown and there's huge civil disobedience and protests? It was really an experiment that hadn't been done before. And then it happened, and everyone abided by it. There were there was a minority of consenting voices, but the majority abided by it. And then there must have been a huge, sigh of relief, and the authorities thinking, whoa, we can do it. In fact, that's exactly what they said. There was, I forget, one of the government's advisors, I forget his name, I think the one who left office,
Dominic Cummings.
That's right, yeah, Cummings. He actually said that we in the government, we looked at the Chinese model, how they locked down their citizens, and we thought, wow, that's what we need to do, but China can do it. Could we really get away with it? He actually said that in an interview, if you can look that up. And so they didn't know if they could get away with it, and they did. So now it's kind of, we're programmed into it. We're kind of like the Pavlov's dog. We're accustomed to it. So we went into second lockdown, into third lockdown. So now, anytime there's an emergency, they can just flick the switch and say lockdown time, like flicking the switch in the Pavlov's animals, and we'll do it, because it's now part of our narrative. Whereas, as you said, that moment, that stop exercise where we could really look at ourselves and analyze and reflect and say, something's really going on here that's not right. Let's deal with this. That only could have come in at the first instance. And we've lost that, because now, you said, the precedent has been set. And just a few months ago, I think it was in August, there was a paper in a medical journal by Fauci and one of his colleagues, saying we have now entered the era of pandemics. We should be now preparing our societies for these, responding to this in these waves. So again, the new dreams being put on top that we may now be accustomed to respond in this way. So what is the solution? If the collective is being hypnotized even further, then perhaps, a process of individual inner realization may be the only way to feed into the collective, because the collective is not feeding beneficially into the individual through these narratives. Maybe it has to come from the other way, where the individuals have to come through their own process and try to put something back into the collective, because otherwise the trance sleep is going to get stronger and stronger over the collective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it's difficult because, as you say, it seems that the turning to the inner self is really the answer. That withdrawal and questioning. Well, what do I want? Not this individual that's been created, the I, and the truly individual self, which is apart from individuality, in quotation marks, as defined by wearing different clothes or identifying with a smaller brand, etc. And it reminds me of John Michael Greer sort of saying to me once that a lot of people who come to occult seminars or seminars on magic or things along these lines, their go-to thing when they begin is, well, if you're so good at all of this, why aren't you rich? Why aren't you famous? Blah blah blah. And he always used to say, it might not have been him, might someone else, so I don't want to put words in his mouth, but you say, well, once you spend even just a few months meditating or thinking on these things, you realize there's things in life which are so much more important than anything that reality offers you as the ultimate goal. And I think, one of the things mentioned once again with Greer before is where you can find power in the modern world. And I don't mean power like over, taking over people or, sieging the government or anything like that. They offer you certain teleologies, certain purposes in life. Your happiness will be complete when you buy X, Y, and Z. And the human power for the Western citizen resides in being able to say and being able to truly do and understand why it's important to say, I don't want that. I don't want this. And that's where power resides. And I think that is the first sense of sort of freedom, is in realizing that everything that they give you, which looks like some sort of delicious meal, is actually very, very bad for you. And the one which they're saying to you, oh, this is a boring, bread and soup, that's the one where you go, no, I want that, and I want that, and I'm happy with that. And I think there's ways which can't be removed or tampered with, that sort of inner freedom, which Ernst Jünger would call the anarch, which that can't be taken away. But to develop that is extremely difficult, because you have to realize that you have to realize what desires have been implanted in you. You have to do a real uprooting and deconditioning of the self. And of course that can only be done from the foundation of having like a sort of realization that maybe something that you believe just isn't what you believe. And I think this can be brought about in people by just asking very, very simple questions when they sort of repeat almost ad verbatim what they've heard on the news or what they've heard from some scientists which no one's ever heard of before, but we trust them because they've said this is XYZ scientist. You say, what do you actually think about that? Do you actually agree with them? And then you sort of see the cogs turning and people, realize, well, I've never really thought about it.
No, I mean, I was just thinking that when you first were speaking, reminded me of a line from Rumi, the mystic teacher, and he said that the greatest obstacle to progress is fame. So it's as if that when you buy into this external story, whether it's money, wealth, status, or fame, then you're already half corrupted, because that's kind of blocking your inner sovereignty. Now, I mean, what you said is it's so right, because usually we feel that what we think, our thoughts, are belong to us. They're ourselves. That's our power. But yet, the society and the governing institutions have been getting to our heads for a long time through propaganda, through so-called, mainstream information channels, and even very, very recently, that's been accelerated through what has been called, from Professor Zuboff's work, surveillance capitalism, whereby they're collecting data on all the things you're doing, what you're looking at online, what your movements are, what your habits are, and that data is used to have power over you because they can nudge your behavior. And what she was saying, Professor Zuboff, was very interesting about how we don't realize it, but our behavior is being nudged into directions that are favoring certain invested interests by this knowledge of our data. And so they can get into our heads. But now I think also it's getting more expansive. And that's also what I talk about in the recent work, is that in recent years, we've been having the narrative of getting into our bodies. So at first, we had the idea of wearables, these wearables that would monitor our heart rate, our metabolism, our sleep patterns, and give us, biofeedback. But of course, that data goes to these huge tech organizations. So, for example, Fitbit, which was a big brand being bought by Google, and they're collecting all the information. Google also is working with the British NHS, National Health Service, and to give kind of AI-based diagnosis on people's medical records. But to have that, they've been granted access to the biodata. And now we're getting this narrative that our bodies are weak. Our immune systems are not strong enough to cope. We have to have outside intervention. We have to have a medical authority. And that plays in, and I explain, that plays into a kind of a very potentially dangerous transhumanist narrative, is that in order to progress, and this goes back to your notion of, progression, in order to progress, A, it has to be technological, and B, it has to be an intervention into our physical sense of self and, biological sense. And so now there's this ability to not only get into our heads, to nudge our behavioral patterns and our thinking patterns, but also the narrative that our body isn't good enough as it is, as a 100% biological construct. We have to have a kind of intervention with technology or external forms of data gathering, and this all, then what it does, it debilitates our sovereign self. It takes away our capacity as a human, spiritual, physical being, because then we're giving away our parts to external authorities. And I think that's a dangerous narrative which is increasing now, James.
Mm-hmm. Well, I completely agree, and it brings to light the sort of the illusion of choice which is given, which is, I think, is the trick that everyone sort of falls for. And you talk about the data of, I'm aware of that book, the Age of Surveillance Capitalism. It's been a while since I've sort of looked upon it, so it might be in there. But the idea that's important to me, I think, in terms of many of the debates around privacy, surveillance issues, privacy issues, data issues, are ones in terms of making sure that certain platforms people are using are securing data. Making sure that, okay, we've obviously got your data, but we're not going to use it for nefarious purposes. It'll only or it'll only be used for this, or even even eventually, well, it's only going to be used for adverts which are tailored to you, so don't worry. And what that lays out is a spectrum of complete presumption, which is, well, hang on, you've got A there, you've got the part A is you have the service, and then part B is the data, and then part C is how they secure it. The presumption lies on part A. No one ever well, more and more people are now, so it would be ridiculous for me to say no one ever, but more and more people are now saying, well, when did we ever ask if we even wanted Facebook? When did we ever say that we even actually needed the internet as much as you're telling us we do? And I think you're finding more people who are finding, that power I mentioned before, where you say, well, no, I don't want that thing you told me is good, even if you say it's the best thing in the world. Being online and projecting your entire life to the entire world, even if that apparently is the best thing that everyone does, being able to say, no, I don't want that. That, I think, is the thing that needs to be brought up. They're not secondary issues. There are, of course, issues because there's things we have to use now, unfortunately, and I can certainly touch on that. It's a frustration, but there's that idea of, well, everyone uses this, so we just need to tackle it. But I think first, the process of deconditioning is to really question, well, why do I even use this in the first place? And something I was just going to throw in there is, if people are applying for jobs now, it's sort of assumed in most jobs, unless you're working in sort of maybe agriculture, but even then, I don't, it may very well be, it's assumed that you will have a phone which is a certain level of technology, and it's assumed that you will have an email address. And of course, if I say things like this, like, why do you need to have an email address? Why do I need to have this phone? I would be called a reactionary, a Luddite, etc. But if you ask someone, well, why is it ridiculous to say I don't want to have an email address? Why is that ridiculous? And I would think that many people would come unstuck with that question, right? And you'd realize many of the presumptions you're falling into. I don't know if you'd agree.
Yes, I mean, I would agree. Is that I think we've come to a point where the line is being crossed. And now, previously, in the prior reality construct, there were kind of lines, and we knew where we were in relation to other things. And, we had this physical body, and we had certain social relations and interactions. And, if someone said that they wanted to get into your body and start just taking your data about how you were sleeping, you'd say, whoa, back off. There was some kind of lines that we knew were not to be crossed. But all that now has completely changed with this advent of technology, and also, social, cultural contexts and circumstances have changed. So now, at first, as you say, it was kind of normal to say, yes, you can use my data, because I've got nothing to hide, the usual kind of thing. If you've got nothing to hide, then why can't I have your data? And now we've come to a point where there are no lines anymore. The food that a lot of people eat are GMO modified. There's geoengineering going on with our environment. We don't know if our thoughts are being scanned. Definitely, if you go through certain airports, they are scanning you. And now you think, I have to get a certain kind of wallet to hold my money, because, scammers can scan your wallet and get your data from your credit card through, RFID scanning. So there is no line anymore. And, so that creates it creates a multiple story. One is that, well, therefore, everything's transparent, everything's open, I've got nowhere to hide. But also it's this complete vulnerability that we probably haven't really recognized, because we've kind of been, the frog slow burning in the water over this. And we've got to the point where the water's boiled, and we've just realized how far deep we are in this. And I think we have to go back also to the question of, which, you raised initially, the concept of progress, and the concept of progress in terms of technology, because we all think technology equates progress. As you say, can you say to someone, I don't want to use an email? Because they'll say, well, you want to go back to the dark ages, mate, So they think that technology automatically equates progress. And I think we have to look at that, and we have to break that apart, because if that's the case, that means the progress for the betterment of human evolution is going to be towards a transhumanism, whereby we're modified hybrid beings with our thoughts entering the cloud, according to the transhumanist agenda, whereby we can be monitored by state surveillance. We are going to be in a complete kind of infrastructure of digital, physical, hybrid monitoring. If that's progress in the future, something's gone wrong. So where's the human being in that? I think we need to pull back a bit and say, well, human progress surely must be about the evolution of human consciousness and the evolution of the human being coming to their awareness of their place and in the cosmos, and what is the meaning for this for them. But if technology is racing ahead and being progress, we may get to a point where we won't even be able to think about, is there a soul? Is there a human spirit? Because we've been so far modified. So I think, there's a real danger in that kind of progress technological narrative, James.
I guess this would probably be the time to ask you, the big question, which neither, we're both constantly sort of struggling towards, I guess, which is, what do you do? What do you do? What do you do? I think maybe the more important question is, because you can differentiate between what do you do when, someone who doesn't know that they're being played by reality. That, I think, isn't really a question, because I almost, if people aren't conscious of it themselves, personally, I'd sort of leave them to it. But I think the more important question is, once you have become conscious that something is up, something's going on, what do you do then? Where do you go?
I think maybe we have to go back to the really basic questions. It may sound naive, but the question is, what makes you happy? Mm-hmm. Because if, we have this, we've been kind of sold the story that we have to have all these things around us and X amount of money to make us happy. But at the end of the day, let's understand that we have mortality. Not that, cut to the transhumanism, but we have mortality. And what is it that you really want to feel self-fulfilled by in your life? My sense is that we really do have to look at our priorities and perhaps make changes in our lives. Because if there's not going to be the same stability that we had before, then why chase a pseudo stability? We can live on less, and that less is our own self. So, what and who do we want around us in our life? And what would we want to feel by the end of this lifetime when we get to reflect back on it? Because the worst thing is to get to the end of your life and think, I really missed out on that. I really screwed up. Let's not have a fear of death, but let's sense that we're living in the now, and every moment of the now is life and death are completely in the same moment. Because the more as you live, you're dying. And so that mortality says, well, where can I place my sense of focus for meaning? Is it with family and friend relationships? Is it with a certain relationship to an area? Is it with a certain career, or is it with something I want to pursue in myself? So maybe we need to go back by asking the really basic questions, and it is, what gives me contentment? What makes me feel right? I mean, feel it in your body, not just your mind. Again, I had a discussion with a friend of mine saying, like, when do you really feel your worst? And they said, when I'm ill. And it's true. When your body's ill, you can't even tell a joke. You feel rotten. And so we realized that, something like this can be taken away from us at a drop of a hat. And we really need to be well in our mind and in our body. And, maybe we do have to ask those simple questions. They're not simple, but they're fundamental, let's say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They're huge questions, though. I think they would fill up a whole nother discussion. And I think, just to keep this one within the bounds of
yeah, perhaps so. They're big questions because there's each question has a billions of answers. It's an individual question. So, we can't rely on an external authority saying this is the answer to your happiness or to your contentment. So there are as many answers as there are people asking the question.
Okay. Just to jump back to your book, is there anything you do think we've missed about it that you think is unique to it?
Not really. I mean, there's different parts of it. I don't think the book is unique. The final kind of part or chapter of the book, I called it Heretical Consciousness. And I said, maybe this is a way to break out, is that, the heretics have always been those seen as outside the system. They were always hounded and persecuted. And because a heretic is a case, I also said there's a form of magical thinking. Magical thinking is thinking outside of these linear ways, thinking through imagination, creativity. Again, going back to these fundamental questions. I think we have to start to imagine, visualize, and try to perceive what is creative for our life. And maybe that will kind of nurture a heretical thinking, that we are not thinking the same as everybody else or the main collective. But I think that has to be nurtured. So I think my sense is that we through this own deep self-reflection and critical analysis, we have to kind of look at what makes me my sovereign self. And if that makes me a heretic, fair enough. But how do I get to being more of myself? And perhaps the fundamental question, the core question, James, especially in this future we're going toward with technology and the paradigm of progress, is what is it that really truly makes a fully human being? And that's the big question.
That is a big question. I'm not sure we can answer it now.
I think we're probably out of time to answer that one, but let's allow everyone to kind of ponder that, because again, it's something we have to think for ourselves. But the more I see the direction of the future going, the more I sense that we have to answer that question for ourselves. What does it mean to be a human being?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Definitely. There seems to be probably the best note to end on, for us to not digress too much further away from, the context of the book. But where can we find the book?
Well, this book I published myself because, as you said, it came out very quickly, and I just wanted to get my thoughts out, quickly without waiting for a 1-year contract with a mainstream publisher. So I published it myself. So it's available online through all online sellers, not only the big ones, but it should be available through all online sellers, also as EPUB. And 1 or 2 articles or chapters from it are on my webpage under my writings menu. So if you go to kingsleydennis.com, you can find some extracts in my essays, along with many, many, many other essays which you can just read from my site. And I would urge every person to go away and make their own thoughts, do their own homework, and figure it out for themselves. Don't just take on board what I'm saying or what you're saying.
Yeah, it seems like unless you have anything else to add, I think that seems like a good place to finish up.
Not for now. I mean, I've enjoyed just having a kind of free flow conversation.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
Some related theme perhaps could be done further down the line with another conversation.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.